You still conscious in there?" someone asked me. A sudden sensation of someone knocking on my forehead pulled me back to reality sometime later. I shot up quickly, only to find that I was still tied down and just simply fell back into my bed. Looking around, the darkness of the room showed that it was still dark outside and was most likely the middle of the night. "Ugh, what time is it?" I asked, and my voice sounding so hoarse that I thought I was about to die of thirst. "Late, maybe 1 in the morning?" the voice told me as my restraints were suddenly untied. "Come on, big guy. Can you stand up or what? How many drugs did that bitch pump you full of?" As my body began to wake up and function, I finally figured it out that it was Nurse Riley who was helping me up at the moment. She knocked me out pretty good," I said as I tried to sit up, and only really succeeded in falling off my bed and landing flat on my face. The only noise I could really make was a long, loud, dull groan. This felt like the worst hangover I had ever had, but max to 1,000. "Some undercover journalist you are." Riley knelt down and tried to pull me up off the floor, grunting and finally getting me to stand to my feet. My head and body were spinning, and it almost was impossible to take a few steps forward without me about to fall flat on my face with a thud. "Only here a few hours and you're already on Sinclair's shit list. Gotta say, that's a new record." She got a chuckle from me as I finally just fell back into my bed, unable to move. "Yeah, really shouldn't have used my real name. Should have used an undercover name, but I just wasn't thinking straight," I mumbled, trying again with all my strength to sit back up. Riley helped me out, but soon covered my mouth as the sounds of someone walking down the hallway came up. After they moved on, she moved her hand and sighed, rubbing her face with my hands. "Alright, this is bad. I was planning on quitting today and running away, but now I gotta help you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a capped needle with some liquid in it. Seeing my apprehension, she put the cap in her mouth and pulled out the needle. "Relax. It's just something that'll help you wake up. Some adrenaline never really hurt anybody," she told me, but before I could really protest, I was jabbed in the leg by her and let out a surprised shout. I quickly covered my mouth, but Riley didn't seem so bothered. "Aren't you worried someone will notice?" I asked as she pulled out the needle and quickly put it back into her pocket. "Trust me, if you weren't screaming, they'd find it more suspicious." As if on cue, a series of screams erupted from the hallway. "Today's harvest day," Riley told me, looking at her wristwatch and uncontrollably tapping her leg. Soon the drowsiness was replaced by a feeling of extreme alertness. "Harvest day?" I asked with a bit of fear. If a place like Sombra treated its patients like cattle, I could only imagine what a day like Harvest Day could mean. Riley nodded and quickly grabbed my hand as she dragged me outside and looked both ways into the hallway before shoving me into the room across the hall. "How is this supposed to help me?" I asked her as we went from one room to another. "Just trust me. I've been here long enough to know how this works." She definitely had that look in her eye like she knew exactly what she was talking about. So I deferred to her judgment, as she did seem to know how to handle herself in a cursed place. "Stay here," she told me as she quickly exited the room and began speaking with someone on the other side of the door. "Where's Mr. Williams?" Nurse Emily's voice came from the hall as she spoke to Riley, I assumed. Where and how had she appeared from? "I already took him down for harvesting, ma'am," Riley told her, seeming nonchalant as if she had just restocked the shelves where she worked. After a few moments of silence, I heard her heels clicking away before Riley returned to the room I was hiding in. "Alright, she bought it for now. In the meantime, you need to see what harvesting is. Then I'll get you out of here." "Why do I need to see what harvesting is?" I asked her, really just wanting to leave at this rate. This whole plan had gone up in smoke, and I was in way over my head with this one as it became abundantly clear. But Riley took my hand again and stared right into my soul. "You need to know what they're doing here," she told me, sending a chill up my spine. She had just shown me a man eating another human with a strange ghost-like shadow monster as his companion. What more could possibly be happening here? "All right," I told her, exhaling and surrendering myself to the story that I so desperately wanted. Where do I need to go? I asked Riley before she pointed to the wardrobe that was in the corner of the room. Hide in there. I'm sure they'll bring a patient in here. This room always gets used. She looked around before poking her head into the hallway. Speak of the devil, get in quick, she shouted with a whisper before she herself escaped out into the hallway. Acting on her orders, I quickly ran over to and climbed into the wardrobe, finding it surprisingly spacious inside. I swear, I've seen that girl somewhere before. Sinclair's voice suddenly appeared in the room. Looking out through the crack in the wardrobe I had left, I saw that it was indeed Sinclair in his demonic shadow, along with a new nurse I hadn't seen before. Nurse Riley, sir? The nurse asked as she grunted and struggled to place a catatonic patient onto the bed. Is that her name? Doesn't sound familiar. But all you women seem to blend together after a while. You are as replaceable as the lead in my pencil, he told her, and to my shock, the nurse nodded in full agreement as she finally got the patient onto the table. What do you think? Do you remember her? Sinclair asked his shadow, turning to look at the monster, who simply shrugged and again let out a gurgling sound that was almost like a laugh. Whatever he said seemed to piss Sinclair off, who simply blew smoke into his shadow's face. He's ready for you, sir, the nurse told the two. Sinclair looked over and nodded before turning to his shadow and squinted at him. Well, do your job, the blonde asshole told his shadow, who quickly wrapped itself around the body and began to melt on it. Soon the patient began to thrash, and to my horror, I saw that he was alive. He began to scream. The shadow spread across the body almost like some horrible slime creature. The patient sat up and tried to pull the creature off of his skin. He fell to the floor out of my field of vision, but suddenly jumping up just in time for me to see the last remains of the human disappear under the black sludge. The form returned to that of the shadow, who quickly slithered over to Sinclair. The whole time I watched on in horror. I had just seen the shadow consume someone, but this seemed different. That should keep you in shape for a few days, unless you require more, Sinclair asked his shadow, who began to shake his head before our eyes met, and that smile on his face grew wider as he slithered over to the wardrobe and quickly threw open the doors. Fuck, was all I could muster to say. Being grabbed by the shadow, I was tossed out of the closet and onto the floor. Sinclair walked over, puffing on another cigar. He may have been an alcoholic, but now he was a smoker, which in my mind was worse for you. That's just my opinion. His shadow gurgled and pointed at me, and it seemed to be enjoying what it was causing me as it made a slow, methodical advance onto me. Stop playing with your food, you idiot, Sinclair told his shadow, causing it to retract from me and over to him. Its smile dipped and it screamed at him almost like a toddler throwing a temper tantrum would do. Sinclair just blew smoke in its face and walked over to me on the floor. I looked over at the nurse who had been with Sinclair, but she was far too busy being preoccupied with changing the black-stained sheets of the bed. What are you planning on doing with me? I asked him, squinting at the well-dressed owner of Sombra as he examined me like some strange museum artifact. Finally, he flicked a cigar in the direction of the nurse, hitting her with the still smoldering end and getting a surprised yell from her. How'd you escape your room? Sinclair asked me, once again completely ignoring my question and asking his own. Suddenly, I remembered what might happen to Riley. She was the sole reason for my escape and for the knowledge I had of Sinclair's shadow and what he was doing to people in this rehab center. Emily didn't tie my hands tight enough, I told him quickly, banking on his seeming hatred of women to my advantage. He stared at me and then over to the nurse who was patting the ash stain that he had caused her. He nodded, seeming to buy the story I had given him. Well, Mr. Williams, if that is the case, then please, allow me to escort you back to your room, he told me. Before I could raise any sort of objection, his shadow slithered over to me and grabbed me by the shoulders, digging its claws into me and making me yelp out in pain. I insist. Being dragged up to my feet, The adrenaline that Riley had given me kept me from feeling the brunt of the pain that had been caused to me, but I wondered for how long it would last. I simply must teach these nurses how to tie patients down more effectively. Otherwise, this will keep happening. Sinclair sighed, walking me across the hall to my room. The shadow at my side slithered along to make sure that I wouldn't run off anywhere, all the while eyeing me hungrily. "Did you really fight in Afghanistan?" I asked Sinclair as he closed the door behind us. He was silent for a moment, and I thought that he would just ignore my question. His shadow looked over at him and then at me, before slithering back over to his master as if to see what was wrong with him. "No. But I am a veteran," he told me, and left it at that. A part of me was pissed off, believing that he had lied to me, and was probably performing stolen valor. But I remember back to the look in his eyes. He had seen combat. The question in my mind was when and where. "Now, if you would kindly lie down back in your bed. I'd rather not have to hurt someone who's seen the horrors of war," he told me with sincerity, a look of dead seriousness on his face. His shadow looked over at him with a frown and angrily hissed. "He doesn't seem to care about me." I pointed at his shadow. Sinclair looked over to the creature that was attached to him and simply waved it away. It obeyed him, but still angrily hissed at me as if it seemed to melt back into the wall and turn back into a seemingly normal shadow. "He's a fickle creature. I barely seem to be able to control him sometimes. But we have an agreement. He keeps me alive and I keep him fed." He shrugged, walking over to me and waiting for me to lay down in his bed. I weighed my options of just bum-rushing him and getting the upper hand while his shadow was gone. But after seeing what that thing could do, I decided against it. Laying down, I watched as Sinclair walked over to firmly tie me to the bed. This time, it felt like my hands were about to be cut off by how tight it was. "If it keeps you alive, just how old are you?" I asked him, seeing that he was actually having a conversation with me. I might as well try and get some information from him. He looked at me and offered me another of his fake smiles. "Still being a journalist, in this situation." He chuckled, tying my ankles possibly even tighter than my wrists had been. "I commend your dedication to your job." Finally being done and tying me to the bed. After that, he pulled up one of his chairs and sat next to me in the bed and stared at me with a smirk. "Fine. You want an interview? I'll give you one." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigar out of his pocket. I might as well die knowing I thought solved the mystery of Constantine Sinclair. I told him, tugging on my wrists and wincing at the pain of just how tight he had tied me to the bed. "Alright, so tell me, how old are you?" I watched him as he clipped the end of his cigar off and snapped at his shadow. It emerged from the wall and slithered over to him, striking a match and holding it up for his master. "I was born in 1888, he said nonchalantly as he blew out a large puff of smoke as his cigar finally came to life. "I graduated from university in 1912 and fought the Great War in 1918, he told me, taking in a big drag from his cigar and sighing as he let out all the smoke in his mouth. You're... I was about to say, trying to work out the math in my head. My mind spun at the implausibility of it all. This man had fought in World War I, and now he was in front of me alive as the day was born. "Oh, old. Yes. I'm aware, Mr. Williams. After returning from France and the horrors that I saw in the trenches and losing my men to German artillery barrage, I was a shell of a creature. It was as if a corpse returned home. My poor mother couldn't handle it, and my father was far from helpful as well. I found that alcohol was the only comfort that I had," he told me, his eyes no longer trained on me but staring off into the abyss. I had been there many times, and I knew exactly how it felt upon returning home. "And how'd you meet that thing?" I motioned my hand over to the shadow, who stared at me with its beady white eyes. Sinclair looked over at his companion and blew smoke in its face, causing the shadow to hiss and back away from him slightly. "That's a trade secret, Mr. Williams. You simply want to know about me. I've told you a few things about me. That should be more than enough." Sinclair sighed, standing up and stretching for a moment before tugging on his dress shirt to get it back into place. "I'm terribly sorry to leave you like this, but I'm afraid if I don't feed him soon, he gets very unruly." He motioned his cigar to me and turned to leave. His shadow followed me as it followed him outside into the hall, the whole time leaving a trail of black gunk that leaked out of his mouth. Now left completely alone, I struggled against the tight bonds and very soon gave up on the whole endeavor. It was nearly impossible to get myself free, and I just resigned myself to soon being turned into shadow food, or for harvesting as well. I stared up at the ceiling for what felt like hours until suddenly my door flung open and quickly closed as footsteps rushed over to me. "Jesus, man! I left you alone for like 3 minutes!" Riley's exasperated voice groaned as she quickly went about cutting the binds that held me in place. God, I was so thankful for her being here. She quickly cut me free with a scalpel and then gave me the item to finish cutting off the restraints. "That shadow thing found me in the closet, all right," I said back in my own defense. "It wasn't like I was going to be able to fight it or something. My ass hasn't gotten into a fight with an occult species like this thing before. I didn't even know where to begin to try to challenge it. Right. And now Sinclair's off in his office talking with one of his business associates, so everyone's on high alert," Riley groaned, taking a seat in the chair that Sinclair had been sitting on and letting out a loud pained groan. She looked close to complete physical exhaustion, her hair a complete mess and her eyes sunken in from lack of sleep. But in those eyes, I could see an endless determination. Getting the binds off my wrists and ankles, I quickly thought in my head, as much as I would have loved to see who this business person was, I was more worried about getting out of this alive. So my plans now turned to escape. Looking over to Riley, I walked over to her and knelt down in front of her. "Can you get me out of here?" I asked her. She looked at me and let out an exhale through her nose, the kind you do when you laugh but there isn't really anything funny about it. "You ever listen to Hotel California?" she asked me, to which I nodded. It was a song I enjoyed quite a bit. "You can check out any time you want, but you can never leave, Desmond," she told me, which made sense to me. Not even dead bodies could leave Sombra, considering it had a morgue and the shadow most likely ate everything that ended up down there. "Still, it's better to try, right? You said you wanted to quit. Might as well try to make a break for it." Riley seemed to think back on what I had said, and she nodded, a new sense of determination on her face, and she quickly sat up and reached into her pockets. "Your adrenaline will be running out soon now." She pulled out some rubbing alcohol and a cotton swab and approached my shoulder. Looking down, I was surprised to see the amount of blood that had leaked out of me. Adrenaline is a hell of a thing, folks. Wincing in pain as she cleaned my wounds and patched me up, we next thought about ways to escape our situation. "What about the morgue? Put a sheet over me and just wheel me down there," I asked her, but she shook her head just as I finished suggesting it. "I told you, we're on high alert. Head nurse Emily would wonder what had happened to you and we'd be found out," she said, pacing back and forth between my bed and the wall. She was really thinking this one through, and I needed to help her on that. If only we could just sneak you out through the front door. But we beefed up security since that patient escaped. I don't know the whole story, but she's the reason this place burned down," Riley said. I made a mental note to investigate it if I ever got out of Sombra alive. "What if you get me an orderly uniform?" I asked her. She looked at me and her eyes lit up. "Just that and the face mask, and I'll look like all those muscle-headed idiots," I told her quickly, and she nodded and looked at me. "Right. Okay. I'll go and find you one so we can hopefully just leave out the front door," she told me, quickly rushing to the door and looking back at me with an excited smile. It was only then that I realized how young she looked. She looked fresh out of college with that excitement. I nodded to her and walked over to the bed once she left. Alone with my thoughts, I began to compile everything Sinclair had told me about himself. Being well over 100 years old with that shadow to keep him alive, there had to be those who knew about him. You don't deal with an immortal asshole like him and not figure out that you're dealing with the same person that your granddaddy did. All of New England knew of Sinclair, and yet no one ever considered how he kept himself so young and vibrant. Others had to know, and that meant people were helping to cover up for his crimes and aid in them. As my mind considered all the possibilities, the door flung open and Riley ran in with a uniform bunching up in her arms. She quickly threw the articles of clothing at me and closed the door behind her as she stayed turned around, seemingly to give me privacy to change. "Do you know anything about his business associates?" I asked her as I quickly began to change into the bright white clothes of an orderly. I watched as Riley stayed by the door and seemed to be lost in either thought or some kind of memory. "I think I met some of them in college. I met him there once. Before, I used to look at Sombra and hope for it to be a dream place to work in. But when I met him in person, he was cold, uncaring, and just an asshole," she told me, looking back at me when I was done changing and wiping a tear from her face. "One of his business associates did horrible things to my friend Travis, and I'm still trying to find and rescue him. I thought by working here I could get to him, but I haven't been able to do so." She sighed as she clenched her fist in determination. "If we get out of here," I placed my hand on her shoulder and gave it a much softer squeeze than the shadow had given to me. "I'll help you look for your friend. I promise," I told her, and she looked at me with tears in her eyes and nodded. She quickly wiped her eyes and her determination came back. "All right, let's head out of here."